Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for a review of the new Cults album, Static. Cults are a pop duo who gathered quite a bit of buzz a few years ago with their debut album and some pretty hot singles leading up until that point, mostly the song Go Outside, which was maybe one of the most viral songs of that year. For sure, listening to these songs, Cults did have a style, an aesthetic, pulling together pieces of rock and roll, jangle pop, a little bit of Motown, some indie pop as well, and just being incredibly cutesy with it. Sugar encrusted like a Sour Patch Kid. And on top of it, there was just tons of reverb and just a weird vintage gritty sound to the way that they recorded their instruments too that just made everything that they were playing seem much older than it actually was. It became pretty apparent that when they put out their full-length debut, their style, while very distinct, was very limited. Not only were a ton of songs on the band's debut sort of uninspired and unmemorable, but very samey too. Especially in the case of Madeline's vocals on this record, which I think was my least favorite thing about this album by the time I was finished with it, because of how light and high and limited in range her vocals are. This record just becomes very unpleasant to listen to. Not grating when you first start hearing the band, but it slowly becomes very... Because I felt that Cults were very attuned to the styles of music that they were copying a little bit and bringing into their tracks, I was hoping that they would mature a little bit onto this sophomore album of theirs, that they would bring maybe more layers, more depth, and just make things poppy, but a little more interesting to listen to upon replay. But as soon as I heard the first track on this thing sounding like the soundtrack to an 8th grade playing out of busted speakers in 1955, I knew that that was not going to happen. Cults have not changed their foundational aesthetic, have not really changed the core of their music at all. They seem pretty content with where they are and what their sound is. For one, Madeline Fullen's vocals haven't changed a bit. I actually think they're a little less entertaining this time around because you kind of know what to expect from her. With the reverb and the instrumentation on this LP, she is incredibly buried, so much to the point where it becomes difficult to make out a lot of her lyrics or really make an emotional connection to much of what she's doing. I actually found her vocals and a lot of tracks on this LP to be unenjoyably lethargic. Take a look at the very comatose duet on the song Were Before, maybe one of the most boring spots in this entire LP. And when I can get a good grip of her vocals, the melody, the cadences, or the lyrics, like on the song Always Forever, for example, it sounds like I'm listening to, I don't know, a local singing talent show as opposed to somebody who is actually putting out a commercial music release. The vocals are just a really huge downside for me on this LP, and I don't see myself ever liking a Cults album if that doesn't change, because with the kind of music that Cults play, vocals are such a focal point. Because the melodies and the backing instrumentation are certainly not stealing the show. Still, this time around, they're incredibly basic. However, I do feel like a bit more ambition and production value came through this time around with layering of instrumentation, like the numerous guitar tones layered on top of each other on the track I Can Hardly Make You Mine, or the sweet organs and the psychedelic effects on Always Forever. The song We've Got It has a pretty sweet key change, So Far has a great string arrangement wrapped around the backing instrumentation. Songs like Were Before and High Road have a very strong backing beat and really separate themselves from the rest of the track list with very standout percussion. But going to the song High Road, that is pretty much what's become the biggest track, the lead single, if you will, with a pretty nice music video off of this LP, and in my opinion, nowhere near as catchy as anything from the band's last LP. I actually think what they do on this track is sort of average for the kind of music that they're trying to play in general. You can catch a lot of very schmaltzy, poppy organ grooves like this on plenty of records sitting in the dollar bin at your local thrift store. And it's not even the dated style and aesthetic that leaves things feeling so uninspired on this record. It's that a lot of the time Cults are such slaves to reverb, the instrumental progression they make on this album leaves very little impact. As far as the instrumentation has been assembled, it's not a bad album. Yes, it's really basic. Yes, the melodies don't really stick with me, but everything kind of falls into place. And it's not that Cult sound is necessarily awful. It's just that over time it just gets really old and doesn't stay interesting for the duration of a full-length album. album, and that was basically the downfall of their last LP. Now, what makes this album less interesting to me, despite the fact that more instrumentation has been thrown into this thing, in a nice way, it's that there are less memorable songs on this thing. This album has much less single power than Cult's debut. It's just got less highlights. I'm feeling a light to decent 4 on this thing. Transition. But if you've given this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Anthony Fantano, Cults, forever.